Okay. So welcome everyone. Welcome to a new session of Strategy International, where we're going to have the opportunity to discuss several topics, and those topics will be aired through our website of Strategy International, where we give the opportunity to a great deal of us scientists that want to participate or that have a knowledge on the subject that we discuss every time to be able to participate if you want on a wider dialogue. And since this dialogue is taking place, we decided to start with a first most important element in the upcoming months. An idea that, considering if you want, the elections are coming in the European Union. And with this said, allow me to talk on the importance of the European Union elections that are coming up in June 2024. Hence, this event is about the European Union, is about the upcoming elections, is about the stakes that we have. We have to share, if you want, the results with, and considering the elections, what will be taking place in the next 5 years. Again, this is an attempt that we're doing with Strategy International that we hope this will blossom. This is a collaboration between experts of Strategy International, and the idea is that through the next discussions that we will have, hopefully we will have every one session a month, we will be able to invite and have keynote speakers where they're going to be introducing the subject matter at hand. And on a following basis, each of you will be able to say bits and pieces with regards to the subject at hand. For us here at Strategy International, first of all, we would like to thank you for watching this event that is now being recorded, and also to tell you that this event will follow with those that would like to write several outputs, if you want, with consideration to our discussion that is taking place here today. And at the same time, please like, share, subscribe, and follow both our Strategy International webpage, but also our YouTube channel, where you can find also the discussions that we do through our podcasts and our web series of Prime Analysis, but also our events that are taking place and shape in different parts of the world. So without further ado, allow me to thank you all for coming here today and having a scientific discussion on the European Union. And allow me to start first, and I will be also the moderator of this discussion today. But we decided that we want to start with the European Union because, not because it's an easy subject, but it is a most important subject for the European area space. It is an election time. It is a time that every 5 years we spend as Europeans, as 27 member states, in discussing the European Union future, both in the European Parliament, but consequently in the European Commission, where the European Union discusses, among others, the policies with regards to health, education, technology, environment, defense, foreign affairs, and things that bind us together, but also challenges in our neighborhood, our immediate neighborhood, but also if you want, the world. The European Union has faced a grave deal of challenges in the latest years, mainly geopolitical in nature and geostrategic in nature, things that involve from the environment and energy to ongoing wars in between Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East, in the Caucasus region, but also in Central Asia. One of the things that has become quite apparent, and I think this is, if you want, one of the elements that we can discuss with us today, is that the European Union now seeks a more global role. But we are yet to define what global role means. And if we want to do a benchmarking, for example, with the United States or other countries that have had a global, if you want, phenomenon, a policy of engagement, if you want, the world, this is a very big discussion that comes up with regard to the future of the European Union. Another challenge and issue that the European Union is actually facing now are those massive waves of illegal migration and illegal migration being one of the gravest concerns in the European Union, not only because of the humanitarian relief work that takes place and has to take place within the framework and the values of the European Union, but how to attract people coming in legitimately in the European Union, staying and contributing to the European economies, but also to the contribution of social inclusion within the European Union. So these are some of the issues that are pertinent with the immediate challenges of the European Union. Extended challenges, but if we can say that these are extended challenges, are the ongoing wars that provide a great volatility within the European Union financial space, but also security space in the European area, but also breaks trade ties or creates new challenges of how the European Union should treat itself in consideration to a changing security landscape. Having said that, there is an obvious division again between West and East, and alliances are still in the shaping forms. And also, we see current state of affairs being changing in bilateral relations with trade partners such as Britain in a post Brexit period of time, but also the relationship with the United States and Canada, the Americans and Mercosur agreement that took them 19, 20 years to be completed, and all actually we're still at the application level. The relationship of the European Union with the African state, the relationship with the European Union with the Gulf states, but also the relationship of the European Union with the eastern part of the world, with the Eastern Hemisphere, mainly Oceania, South Asia, China, and also the reaction and responses to a Russia that is non-ending story in terms of its illegal fight in Ukraine, its illegal involvement, attack in Ukraine, to say the least. At the same time, volatility in the Middle East continues to exist. There is no solution to the problems that are such. Humanitarian destruction is upon us, and it is upon the European Union to take swift and strong results in order to first end the war and the atrocities, but at the same time counter any kind of terrorist activity, both in the Middle East area, but also in Africa or Central Asia, or where extremism is seen is pointed out to be shown. All in all, we're looking at a European Union where the challenges of an internal expensive economy, as the European economy is at this point, with rising inflation, great projects, but at the same time, projects that do not have an impact, a direct impact factor to our society at this point, may be the key challenges, if you want, with the rising expectation of extremes becoming a possibility, a more strong and more evident possibility in the aftermath of the European elections. The European Union, to say bluntly, is our common space. And the European Union shares values, ethics, and morals that are not negotiable with the rest of the world, but have to be attributed to the balance that brings together culturally, morally, politically, economically, and scientifically these countries together in the European Union space. So it is very important that we keep, if you want, the scientific value and cultural value and political sanity of the European Union intact in order to see a more globalized European Union, a more involved European Union, while at the same time it becomes a less bureaucratic European Union and a European Union that does more to the European citizens and those that trade with the European Union, and hence becoming an even greater strategic partner in the world affairs. This is only an introduction. This is not a point of only statements or concerns. I will leave the floor for a few rounds of introduction by those that would like to raise the first points also and have a discussion with them. I will just only ask of you to raise your digital hand. I know that we have people from different parts of the world. So we have people from Guam, we have people from Lebanon, we have people from Israel, we have people from different parts of the world, from Greece, from Cyprus, from Canada, We have people from the United States. So the expectations are that you are going to be able to share your opinion on how you are seeing things from a second eye or third eye as a European Union citizen or non-European Union citizen, to be able to stress a few things which you will deem as important to stress in the aftermath, if you want, of this introduction of discussion. Just for the time of keeping a continuity between us, please raise your digital hand, and once you're done, please give the floor back to me so I'll be able to give it to our next colleague. I will start with Cleanthis, who's raised his digital hand first. Cleanthis, the floor is yours. Please provide us your first inputs. Thank you. Cleanthis, we cannot hear you. You're muted.
Yes, sorry. So again, I would like to thank you for inviting me. It's good to see all of you here and be able to share some thoughts as regards EU and the EU Parliament elections. Let me start by saying that without being Eurosceptical myself, I think that European Union is, as you said probably before bluntly, is also dysfunctional. Now, what is the problem? It is a supranational entity that is not supranational. The supranational aspect really deals with low-end politics, not with the real stuff. And I will explain what I mean, because the real stuff is practically intergovernmental. So if we want to see what are really the non-EU competencies or the limited competencies, we have everything that is important. We have the defense, we have the civil rights, the human rights, the crime, social policies, most of them, education, health. These are limited or non-EU competencies. But there are some exclusive EU competencies, and now you will understand why I mean about this low politics. We have agriculture, customs, foreign trade. Okay, monetary union is important, or market regulation, but again, very, very limited. So I think that the problem is, and we have, now the elections, that European Union does not have a free hand to express the opinion of the Europeans. First of all, the citizens vote for the European Parliament that supervises the European Commission. But what is the power of European Commission? What is the power even of the Council of Ministers? What is the real power? So all the decisions are made in capitals, not in Brussels. They are made in Berlin. They are made in Paris, not in Brussels, really. This is the truth. So the truth is that we have many EU institutions, but we don't have really a strong EU. And if we want to change that, we need to address this point. We need to address the supranational identity of a supranational entity. So do we really want more Europe? If you ask the Europeans, as a European citizen, I will tell you, everybody says we want more Europe. But what is more Europe is different, in the mind, in the mentality of the German, of the French, of the Greek, that they all want more Europe. So, and another thing which is interesting again, because we are going to have, the elections for the parliament, you see that always this is a reflection of, national ideas, policies, and politics. Has nothing to do with European policies or politics. Even in the campaigns in most countries, the parties' representatives, the parties' candidates for the European Parliament, they do speak about issues that are domestic issues, not European issues. And in the end, what we see, it's the same tendency. So if you have, for example, the rise of the left wing, as we had, in Greece for a while, in Spain, in Italy, or then if you have, right wing, as we had in Hungary, in the Netherlands, in many other countries, in France, of course, Front National is very, very strong. So you see that really this is reflected in the European Parliament, and we do not have really European policies mandated. And when we have some policies as regards important things, for example, the war in Ukraine, this is because we have, the agreement at least of the most important countries in the European Union. So I think that we need a more supranational EU and less intergovernmental EU. We need to really delegate some authority to Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kleanthis, for this. I think this was quite interesting to delegate more powers in the EU. Now, again, me, myself, not being a European skepticist myself, but also being a European baby, I do find a very interesting role for having the European Union more active engagement. But I also believe that European Union should be more close to the European citizens in all levels of market and in all levels of effectiveness, which is something that we have to take into consideration, because in the EU institutions, the European Parliament is positioned, but the European Commission is elected from within. So this is also a matter that we need to take in consideration, considering that the EU will be doing more work needed involved into this. But let me give the floor to Michael Grossman, who raised his digital hand. Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I guess I'm kind of looking at it from the U.S. outside perspective here, and I think one of the things, Marius, you first of all, thank you for inviting us, but also, you listed kind of the challenges that the EU is facing, and I think one of the things you left off is relevance globally, because honestly, I think with the war in Ukraine and this kind of move towards multipolarity, right? You see a lot of talk about US, Russia, China. Where's the EU in all this? Where's Europe in all this? Because I think from the US perspective, Europe to some extent is purely instrumental in terms of, does it serve US interests? Right. And that's where I think from the US perspective, that's where they kind of look at Europe. Right. I think Donald Rumsfeld, when he said the whole, old Europe, new Europe line, I think he said the quiet part out loud, where the United States basically tends to look at Europe in terms of which country serves our purpose, which country is with us, which country is not with us, so it's very kind of, like I said, it's more a tool of maintaining US hegemony. And you see the same thing now with Russia. I mean, Russia basically has come to the conclusion that kind of the thing that seems that the big question is, how does Europe maintain its relevance globally, right? Or have we in fact reached a period in kind of global history where, at this point, in fact, the center or the kind of the poles have shifted to the point where Europe is no longer relevant globally, right? It is simply a kind of an appendage of American foreign policy.
Okay, that's quite interesting. You're saying that, Michael. And while you were talking, I was actually thinking that maybe we should also break down at some parts. So keeping this as an introductory remark, so we can start the engagement of the discussion, and then go on bits and pieces as well, and go on a second round. Actually, this is one of the things that we will distinguish probably in the discussion that we're having today, is that the European Union works in different ways than the United States, in a sense that the United States itself is more keen, has resolved decision-making processes, when the European Union is keen on exchanging, deciding, and upscaling its decision-making before it goes global. So while we want to become more global, want to be more engaged, and want to be more effective, we also need to take care of our home grounds, if you want, on the ways that we take decisions, on the ways that communication takes place. And at this point, I'm thinking on, one time that when they asked when they asked Kissinger, and I think this is valid, When we want to talk to someone in the United States, we speak to the US president, whereas when you want to call the European Union, they say if you want to speak to the European Parliament, dial 1. If you want to speak to the European Commission, dial 2, and goes on and on and on. The European Union has a challenge that is called bureaucracy. And this is a matter of the fact. But once the European Union actually decides that it wants to act, it does do that. Namely, for example, on the operation, let's say now in the Red Sea, or other operations with regards to migration issues or economic support of other countries, when the United States was not ready to decide on further support on Ukraine, for example, the European Union has agreed on another 50 billion euros of support towards Ukraine, while noticing that, you know, Ukraine wants to be more integrated to the EU, wants to become part of the EU, and that is the result shows that the EU works, but it works in a very not fast, not swift way, probably because the system of governance is different. So we're opening a discussion on how governance is achieved in the EU, which cannot be compared at this point with the United States. Rather, we can learn the good, the bad, with regard to the relationship with the US and the EU. But let's come back to the discussion. I think it's valid. It's a valid way and a valid point of view of how a non-EU citizen sees that from the point of view of the US, and that's valid. Thank you very much. I'll give now the floor to Dr. Ellie. And then we'll give the floor to Jerome as well. Yes, Dr. Ellie.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, again. A few thoughts, since this looks like more of a brainstorming. So the first one is, the question that I always have is whether we should expect an actual cohesive EU, or a more cohesive EU, let me put it this way. We've seen at least in the last 20, 25 years, I think the EU reached its limits to how much they can come up with a cohesive foreign policy, let alone some cohesive economic policies and other stuff. So I think with the size of the EU today, the diversity, the rise of populist governments in some parts of Europe, etc., I have a big question mark about how much we can expect a more cohesive EU. Maybe we should settle on the idea that the EU is not going to be cohesive anymore, at least in the midterm. My second point is about the neighborhood. The EU invested a lot in neighborhood policy. I'm afraid most of the elements of this policy are now obsolete, outdated, and not relevant anymore. If you look at towards the east, we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. This is not a war that will end soon. Whether the hostilities end soon or not I think is a minor question from my perspective, but the implications of this war will last for a while, and I'm not sure that the EU has a common vision on how to deal with it. South, we're seeing how the Middle East is still in trouble, not only because of the most recent war in Gaza, but fragility in the Middle East is becoming more endemic. Even countries with a lot of resources like Iraq, like Libya, Algeria, etc., are struggling with fragility. So it's not anymore about giving money or not giving money. It goes much beyond that aspect. And looking at how the EU is dealing with this fragility, the least I can say is that I'm disappointed. As someone who's coming from this part of the world, I tell you that it's a big disappointment to see how the EU is looking at and dealing with this fragility in this part of the world. Obviously, the conflict in Israel right now, or between the Israelis and the Palestinians, is going to have also long-lasting effects. And one of them that very, very few are talking about actually is how weak Israel is going to be in the next few years. Once this war is over, Israel will go into a major political upheaval, domestic one, that has nothing to do with the Palestinians, but that will basically be triggered by the accountability mechanisms that we put in place to hold people accountable for October 7 or everything that followed that. Economically speaking, Israel will be weak. This will open the appetite of the Iranians and other regional powers to take advantage of the situation. So we're really looking into the next probably 5 years going to be a period of major shifts in the region. And I don't know if the EU has, at least, I wouldn't say an understanding, but at least scenario planning for that. When it comes to Africa, we've seen the demise of the French in several African countries, although I wouldn't project the failure of France on the entire European Union, but I'm sure there are implications as well for the Europeans, especially that the space that has been left by the French is being filled by the Russians. And this is not only if you look at the map of the Russian influence in Africa, it's not limited anymore to the Sahel or to some parts of the former French colonies, but they are trying to also establish themselves in Northern Africa, which is the southern shore of Europe, of the European Union. And for this, they're trying to build a relationship with the military. So they're using basically a strategy that has been used by the Americans for a while, which is to disregard a lot of elements of any given country, but to focus on a relationship with the military. So the military to the military relationship in Egypt, the Russian relationship with the Egyptian military is on the rise. It's much better, much quantitatively better, quantitatively more than it used to be. With the Algerians, it's known that the relationship is great. They're trying to infiltrate Tunisia. In Libya, they have a direct military presence. So if you really look, with the exception of Morocco, the rest of North Africa is seeing an increased Russian military presence that will have an impact on Europe. Last thing, and I'm sorry for this long long list of issues, is the US elections. If the elections happen today, all the indicators are that President Trump will win again. If this happens in November, as of next year, there will also be a major shift in how the US will be looking at Europe. We've seen a precursor of that under the first mandate of President Trump, but now with the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, I think any future Trump administration will have a more, I would say, strict policy towards the EU and a completely different vision of the transatlantic alliance that has been so crucial and important for both the EU and the US. I'll stop here. I'm sure there are many other points, but I took enough time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eli. For those of you that do not know Dr. Eli used to be the director of the United States Institute of Peace for the MENA region. He's based out of the MENA region as well, both in Algeria and Lebanon. So he has a very good knowledge of the area, and he has joined us as not only an expert, but also as advisor to Strategy International for a lot of things that we're doing together. And I thank you again for those inputs, but also everybody else, Michael, for the US position at this point, which is also a valid position. We see some sort of similarities on the way that people understand and comprehend the EU from outside the EU. And so far we've heard, I mean, except myself, where I put things into a challenging, if you want, situation. We heard Cleanthes stating that we want a more strong, more vivid EU, more centralized powers in the EU, where EU powers should be taken into consideration and on the capability, on the things that basically until now other colleagues are criticizing, on the cohesion, on cohesiveness, on the way that it, that the power of Europe can be transpired in its immediate neighborhood policies, but also in the globe. Accountability and decision-making is a process of the EU that we will have to check. And it seems so far, to what we have said, that the EU may have a problem, considering that all of us are expecting some sort of unexpected results with regards to the EU, but also unexpected results in the US if Trump gets elected, which also brings us to a new reality of a political spectrum that is to be developed globally, bilaterally, but also in impacted regions such as the Middle East and the MENA region in wider perspectives. Let me just now give the floor to another colleague of ours, Jerome Wienerberg, and I think Jerome is inside there. Actually, Jerome and I, we know each other for decades as well. And Jerome is actually the creator of this idea of having this get-together, scientific get-together at Strategy International. I thank you, Jerome, for putting this idea together. And I think this gives and complements, if you want, all scientists and all experts that are working here at Strategy International, and also the capability of people to learn more from all the discussion, the opinions that we're putting through here today. But Jerome, the floor is yours. I know you have the French link, you also have the Israeli link, you also have the expertise of the various regions within the EU link, among others, Greece. What's your input on the European elections and what is at stake in front of us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and nice meeting you all. I checked a little. First of all, I'm very pleased to see that I agree with most of the analysis on the challenges which are going to strike, let's say, Europe. I slightly disagree on the dark picture which is made out of this. I think that I would see more challenging than difficulties for them. But basically, I have a slight issue with the way that we want to see Europe as a central place, and we want more Europe and so on. When I check the polls of the European Union citizens, there is a poll which has been done for Euronews by Ipsos, which gives the following topics as the main issues of the voters. Number one is economic issues. Number two, healthcare and pensions. Number three, economic growth. And number four and five, climate and migration. Now, although migrations come at the last position, we have to take polls with, with some reserve. The polls, I made some calculations. Okay, I'll just go to the bottom line. Is that it doesn't matter how I made the calculations and from which perspective I've done them, but together the ECR, EPP, and ID, so the economic conservative and the identity and democracy polls and the wider EPP would get from the right wing a majority, and this is without even the cooperation of the Renew, more central party. Of course, to get this majority, I had to use the non-inscribed, the independent people who would join, representative who would join the right. I tried to make a coalition from the left side, and I could not get it. Whatever I do, I miss 10 to get a majority from the left. Now I've said this, I want to say that if the right wing indeed wins, and if we can trust this poll, and some others also I've checked, which have been less precise, but which have reached the same conclusion. I don't think that the European citizen would like more Europe. I think they want more welfare. I think they want to recover after the COVID austerity policies. I do agree with what was said also about the potential arrival of former President Trump or future President Trump. But I wouldn't see that as a difficulty. In fact, if we have a right-wing coalition in Europe, and if Trump is passing, there have already been some contacts which have been done with the Italian Premier, Giorgia Meloni. And I think we could have a nice, cooperation with the States. I'm not looking at the political side of it. I'm just looking at the force that together the US and the EU could have to tackle some challenges they have together. And reach a brighter conclusion for the difficult challenges which have been reminded here.
Thank you very much, Jerome. And I think this was very valid. That actually shows, if you want, the divergence that we have from within the EU and outside the EU, the way that you explain things, you concentrating mainly on the subject issues of the EU, the ones that we said from the beginning: economics, politics, migration, inflation, education, health. Correctly put the Ipsos Gallup basically that have done on citizens of Europe, which actually shows what the Europeans are more concerned about. And it also shows, if you want, a more closed EU rather than the global EU. So you have, on the one hand, citizens talk about the more pressing issues within the EU, where our current leadership in the EU talks about the issues that are pressing us outside the EU. And with our former speakers, both Michael and Ellie, it shows very much the differences that on the way that we envision and we see Europe and its challenges. Correctly put, in the end, you put a very interesting thing that two forces combine, EU-US, and the transatlantic relationship, something that was also mentioned by our predecessing speakers, also I think by Ellie in this case, is the challenge that brings us together, considering the strong geopolitical winds that are coming and hitting on the doors of Europe, considering the ongoing wars that are taking place so far. But we'll come back to this. Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Robert. Robert, are you there? Robert is from Canada. He's joining us from Canada, and Robert has been with us from almost the very beginning of strategy, and he's much also an expert not only on Canadian EU relations but also transatlantic relations. He was heading the transatlantic, if you want, ties of Canada with NATO, celebrating the 75 years of NATO's relationship. But this is not a NATO discussion. It's more like a European discussion. What's the input from the side of a Canadian seeing the things as they develop in Europe? Robert?
I was very happy to see the question of the distribution of the parties in the or the fractions in the European Parliament brought up by the last speaker, Jerome. I believe your name is. Glad to meet you. I must say that although the presentation or the statement that was made was purely on the basis of mathematical calculation and therefore theoretically correct, I at least, and I think I am not alone, would be very surprised to see the EPP in a coalition with the ECR, even more surprised to see it in a coalition with the ID, and absolutely astonished to see it in a coalition with NI, so that a right-wing majority will not be, in my view, even if it exists mathematically, it will not be the ruling majority in the European Parliament. I should say that in my view, and this does not implicate, the motives or the analysis of the last speaker, but the threat, because that's what it was called, of a right-wing shift in the European Parliament was raised several months ago, toward the end of last year, when there was, in fact, a danger that the EPP, the S&D, and the Renew would barely get 50% of the seats. There are 720, you need 360 for a majority. There was a poll that the ECFR published in January, which showed the EPP, SD, and Renew getting about 380. That's a very close call, especially given all of the uncertainties with the individual members in the EP and so on. I'll talk about.
Robert, we lost you for a minute.
I'm back. Yes, I'll talk about the Greens in a moment. Now, what, in my view, what the and I will call it what I see it to be, the elite-driven information policy concerning the alleged threat, which does not exist, of a right-wing shift, of a decisive right-wing shift in the European Parliament, was driven, first of all, by the German parliamentarians and second by the French, because as you may know, the EPP has been run and is run basically by the German CSU, with some of their Belgian and Netherlands and Dutch co-partisans, and the S&D is basically run by the German SPD with their with their Dutch and their Belgian co-partisans, and the Renew is basically run by Macron's party with a few Danes and a few other people, so that when this campaign in the information media was launched, it was actually quite successful. You look at the polls in February, and the estimated distribution amongst these three parliamentary parties, EPP, S&D, and Renew, went from about 385 to 420. That's pretty good. And now it's back down to about 405. Now, I will open a parenthesis now and come back to the European Parliament in just a moment. But it's necessary also to say that one of the real concerns is that why this is an elite-driven information policy is that, as you know, many national and municipal elections are being held simultaneously with the European elections. And these have the danger of, from the view of the European elite in Brussels and their representatives in their national capitals, such as Donald Tusk in Warsaw, to actually reflect a grassroots, to actually express a grassroots sentiment, and with the threat that it may achieve some legitimacy through electoral success, and even affect national policies that would then possibly even put a brake on the further development of the pan-European policies to which the national and so-called Eurosceptics, to use that term, are skeptical. So that this is a two-level game. There is the attempt to assure a significant majority, which now exists. It's 405, and you need only 361 for majority of the EPP, S&D, and Renew, and also to drive turnout at the local level so that the local and national interests will be minimized in the electoral result because of their possible influence on national policies. So that is now about the Greens. Before I get to the Greens, I'll mention that the other danger from the pan-European elite standpoint is that the ECR and the ID fractions in the parliament are neck and neck almost, but not quite, with Renew for third place in the parliament. And that is significant because of the distribution of privileges and the representation across different committees, and who gets to be a co-chair of different committees, things like that. So that is also an alarm that the ECR, SD, Renew group, which is the ruling group in the parliament, the majoritarian group in the parliament, has about the European elections. Now, this also translates a diminution over time of the influence of the German parliamentarians themselves. 10 years ago, the EPP and S&D had almost 50% of the seats by themselves. 5 years ago, they could have had a majority with Renew, but they also wanted to bring the Greens in. You had Timmermans there running the Green policy. And the question is, since the Green policy, the new Green Deal, has fallen into a certain disfavor and shown itself at least in the new circumstances, to be somewhat dysfunctional, if it was not dysfunctional to start with, then the question becomes, how much will the EPP, S&D, and Renew, or without Renew, have to depend on the Greens? What positions, if any, are the Greens going to demand in the new European Commission, such as they demanded for Timmermans, with success, who was, as you know, was a vice president of the Commission and also head of the Green New Deal? So these, I think, it seems to me that these are some of the stakes at issue in the parliamentary elections themselves, without regard, and of course the question of the appointment of the High Representative. Who's going to succeed Borrell? Is he going to succeed himself, and so on? The EU, in my humble opinion, has an abysmal representation for the last 15 years since Solana left the scene at this level. And so that's also another question of what's that going to be. It's arguably the most, because other participants, I'm coming to a conclusion now, other participants in this discussion have liberally mentioned the question of the European Union's international actorness and security policy and neighborhood policy and all that, so that the High Representative, Vice President, High Representative for Foreign Policy is arguably one of, from the outside world, next to the President of the European Commission, is the most important spokesperson, even if they don't have a lot of power, for the European Union, even over the President of the Council of Ministers, the Charles Michel, whom we've heard of, but who that post outside of Europe never gets a great deal of attention. It's always the President of the European Commission and the High Representative for Foreign Policy who get the most attention. So that's also the stakes, but no one knows what's that going to be, because that's going to be like, a side appointment. That's going to be, the roll of the dice. Maybe Kaja Kallas is going to be, who knows? Her name was floated. Nobody knows. It's been a surprise. Mogherini was a surprise. Ashton was a surprise. Borrell was a surprise. Nobody knows who's going to get that job. It's going to be, smoke-filled room dealing who's going to get that job. So anyway, those are some of the stakes. I'm very happy, and I want to thank Jerome for bringing us back to the current event, which is the elections to the European Parliament. And I'm very happy, and I thank him for opening the door for me to offer these remarks, which I had given some thought to previously and was looking for an opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. Just to thank you very much. You've said a lot on the party electorate, which I think was missing the if you want a more clarified position on what to expect from the actual elections, and that's a very important element to state. Also, to clarify a few things with regards to local elections, not in every European state you have local elections and European elections at the same time. It is not. It all depends.
No, but I'm sorry to interrupt you. I did not imply and did not say that was all of them. Is that very many of them, including key ones such as Poland.
Yes, it's also taking place in Cyprus, and it becomes even more complicated because you have local, peripheral, and in some cases, like in Cyprus, also here they also vote for local community school leadership areas. So there was one big question: how do you put a ballot one all together, and how many times will people vote for different parts? And that's a real challenge, especially if you consider old age of some people or first time voters. This is also some very important element. Now, I like the last part where Baroness Catherine Ashton or Mogherini, for example, were not names that were known in the European Union area, but nevertheless, like Charles Michel, they were known to the European Union corridors, and the potential was there. And I think this is a part where we were saying in the beginning with Kleanthis that we need more Europe. In fact, we need more clear Europe on how decision is done, what is the dialogue, what is taking place, and so on and so forth. And I think in between brackets, Euronews and all the other European media cells that were there, their attempt was to bring a more Europe in every corner of Europe. But we're not at the level yet where you have, for example, like in Canada, you have information going from one side of Canada to the other, like the United States from one side to the other. So I think it's also a challenge on how to bring a more clearer institutional part of the EU, while at the same time we have challenges to see who's going to lead in which level of position. Correctly put, the head of the European Parliament, the head of the Commission, the one who's going to be leading the foreign and security office of the EU. Also about the Green Deal and how the Greens are gonna work on this, but also the right wing. Correctly put, the right wing, and I'm not gonna agree or disagree totally on the elite-driven policy on the right wing, but definitely the Germans on a centralized government don't want the rising standards of this. But it also looks like Meloni's equation on how to bring the right wing in a more European balance and acceptance of EU moral values and ethical values actually seem to work, because Meloni has been quite agreed and accepted in the EU corridors, in the EU leaderships. And actually, Meloni has turned to be a very good example of how dialogue takes place in the EU. But we're waiting to see in each part of the states of the EU, things are driven differently, considering also the national elements, what is taking place in each state politically, sociologically, economically, health-wise, education-wise. And also, I believe that there will be some kind of different result, considering the ones that are bordering the outer skirts, if you want, of the EU, where these countries are the first entrants of the EU, namely Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Cyprus. They have more at stake in difference with the western part of the EU, or if you want, also the north part of the EU, with Baltic states having having the threat of a real threat of Russia expanding the war situations in for a longer term in Ukraine, but not only. So
Marios, before you pass the platform to Kyler, would you allow me a very, I promise, short follow-up on Meloni? Of course, the reason why she's been accepted is that she has delivered abysmally on her campaign promise to limit migration. And not to put too fine a point on it, but one of the reasons why that is that Italy gets how many 191 billion euros? I don't even know the number. It's like up there, from Brussels. So Meloni is like the right wing, the right of center counterpart to the Greek Syriza, which also fell through on all its promises and became compromising, and because they depended so much on the financial aid. So I just want to throw that out there, that for your consideration, that's my one-off interpretation. I haven't thought much about it, and the Syriza situation much better than I do. But you mentioned Meloni, so I thought that had to be explained. Is that she's not followed through on her promises on immigration, and that's because of the country's financial dependence on Brussels.
Yep. Thank you. Point taken. I mean, she was keen on talking about the African policy, because Italy has a great problem from the African area coming. So she was indeed pushing the EU for more funds. She was indeed pushing for more EU cohesion with regard to Southern European states, and that's a reality of this. But now it seems that has effects. Also, let's not forget that the EU has recently agreed on a joint migration policy, and we're yet to see this in practice. Probably we'll see this after the elections, but definitely countries like Greece and Cyprus and Italy and Spain and even Malta are going to be heavily engaged, because they are the first receivers of great numbers coming in from a variety of parts of the world. Actually, a few days ago, Cyprus has been receiving illegal migration also with big numbers from Lebanon. And I think this is a more geostrategic in purpose, because now it seems that it's cut from Turkey's side, so it's going from the Lebanese side, and so on and so forth. So that requires a more engaged EU. But we'll come to this in the near future. And as you can understand, we cannot cover all topics at all levels, obviously. But the reality being that illegal migration is a real threat, and it's a European security threat for all. So there needs to be a direct role and engagement into this. I'll give the floor to Kyler, and then we'll turn probably to George Anipsiou. Yes? Kyler. We cannot hear you.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. And thank you for organizing this meeting where we can exchange ideas and thoughts. I definitely cannot meet the caliber of the previous speakers, but I can definitely share my understanding and thoughts on the EU's role in international relations. I would, of course, concede that there are dysfunctionalities in the EU as a supranational institution, and I guess that's naturally so, as one of the first ones in world history. And of course, it's sort of difficult when you have three bodies that are more or less running the operation, the commission, the council, and the parliament. Of course, the commission and council have more power, let's say. So I do agree that there are dysfunctionalities and of course things could improve. But I think as an entity in itself in the international relations field, it's important where it pulls all the resources together of the various member states in order to make or get the most advantage it can in the international arena vis-a-vis other countries. So I could maybe after I talk a bit, I could talk about the specific implications of the EU Parliament elections on EU Pacific Island relations in light of the theoretical right turn of the composition of the European Parliament. But first, I just want to briefly showcase just the idea that the EU as an entity in international relations is important in terms of presenting the European continent and the European people and getting the best that they can for the 500 million people or so that make up the European body. So of course, with EU transatlantic relations, in terms of, let's say, the threats from China, Russia, Iran, they have their councils, like the Technology and Trade Council. So that's one way where they can work together in order to counter, let's say, the meta or the large-scale trends in global affairs. So I guess in this way, the EU might not be as dysfunctional as it seems when it's looked at from a domestic national angle, national meaning the member states. Of course, the EU could be less bureaucratic, but that just sort of happens when you're a massive institution. But I think that's just one area that shows how important the EU is in international relations. Of course, there's the NATO angle, where the EU sort of complements NATO. The EU member states are providing Ukraine with military gear, whereas NATO is not, in order to, you know, make sure that NATO doesn't get involved with the conflict. So they're sort of complementing each other there. And then the EU also has its largest trade with Asia. And Asia, as we all know, is sort of the center of gravity of the world, or it's coming to be if it isn't already. And so the EU has a large role to play there in terms of influencing the goings-on in Asia, of course, to the best that it can, being on the other side of the large Eurasian landmass. But again, just to remind everyone, Europe does have a crucial role to play in the Indo-Pacific because it is an Indo-Pacific player because of France, largely. Of course, we could say that that doesn't really play a role, but it definitely allows the EU to say it has a direct role in the Indo-Pacific affairs because of the French territories and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans. So I guess there, again, the EU has an important role to play, especially if it's going to work with the US and other like-minded countries like Korea and Japan and India and Australia to sort of balance the way things are turning out in the world. Again, just quickly, the trade corridor with India and through the Middle East, that's another way that the EU as an entity in international relations is important. And then also the digital connectivity it has with India and Japan. These are partnerships it has. So just quickly talking about Pacific Island relations with the EU, because I'm in the Pacific, I think if we were to take for granted that there will be a turn in the right, as commentators have said, although as Dr. Roberts said, that might just be elite talk. But if we were to take that there will be a turn in the right, or turn to the right in the composition of the European Parliament, I think there's still room to say that that EU Pacific Island relations will continue and still thrive. People might be concerned, or Pacific Island countries might be concerned because their biggest existential threat in their view is climate change, because sea level rise will affect islands. And looking at the right, for example, this ECR and the ID, they are not, let's say, historically in favor of climate change action. However, if we look at their voting records, for example, with the Indo-Pacific Strategy report that was published or that was agreed to by the European Parliament in the summer of 2022, actually, these parties, for the first one, which was about the EU and security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, the ECR, or more than 75% of MEPs in the further right European conservatives and reformists abstained. Oh, should I stop? Okay. Okay. Whereas And that was for the security challenges. But then there was another report that came out that the European Parliament passed. And here it directly mentioned climate change, but MEPs in the ECR and ID actually voted in favor of this. Again, this is a EU strategy report that was launched, voted on in the European Parliament, and it passed in 2022. So you can say that maybe domestically, the ECR parties, or the parties that make up ECR and ID, they would be against climate change action. But here it seems that they agreed to, or at least abstained or did not vote against these reports. So it shows that maybe they have one way of interacting in the European and national scene, but on the international scene, they have another way of acting. So considering that the right was dominant in national European politics in 2023, again, this could be a view for concern for Pacific Islanders. Yet, given the context of a war in Ukraine, Europe's interest in Taiwan because of the war in Ukraine and also for economic reasons, and then, of course, given the overall competition it has with China, I think that engagement with Pacific Islands will continue to grow, especially because of the recently signed partnership agreement with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states grouping. This was actually signed last year in 2023, and in a few days, there will actually be a vote in the European Parliament on whether or not the EU Parliament will agree to accede to this agreement. And then, of course, the member states have to agree and whatnot. But at least there will be a vote next week, actually. It's called the Samoa Agreement, which reflects the name of one island country in the Pacific called Samoa. Again, I mentioned that France is in the Indo-Pacific because of its territory, so the EU has a direct role to play there. So again, I think that even if there was a right turn in the European Parliament, there will still, Pacific Islanders don't necessarily need to be concerned because of their great concern for climate change, because according to the history or the voting record for these two reports in 2022 about the EU and the Indo-Pacific, the right-wing party or right-leaning parties or right-wing parties, a majority of their members agreed, or at least didn't vote against these reports. So as a summary, the EU has a role to play as an international entity, although it may be dysfunctional bureaucratically and as a European body.
Thank you very much, Kyler. And allow me to say to everyone watching this this recording that Kyler is in the western tip hemisphere of Guam. He's in the island of Guam, and which is the western tipping point of the United States, I think. He's one of our young scholars. He's been very active in the Indo-Pacific area, and you can see some of his writings there. And in fact, within the month of April 2024, we will publish. We will be showing you a web series discussion with Senator Underwood, who's also head of the Indo-Pacific Alliance within the United States government, and also an advisor to President Joe Biden at this point for Indo-Pacific affairs. Thank you very much, Kyler, for this inside information and the way that you have approached things from an Indo-Pacific area is a very. I think that's especially interesting. And I was seeing Dr. Ali shaking his head, and Jerome shaking his head when you said about that. You know, it's basically because of the French that we have an interest in those areas, which is actually a truthful element, but I also think because of the Anglo-Saxon, if you want, alliance in the region. But we'll come back to this. I think Dr. Michael would like to add his input on something. Dr. Michael?
Actually, that's but more of a question. And we're kind of trying to get a sense here because, you know, it seems like, you know, what Kyler just talked about, that it's, you know, the EU has influence in the Pacific area because of France. And you, Mario's mentioned that it's also because of the Anglo-American descendants. Is it EU or is it European countries? I guess that's kind of the question, right? Is it a situation where the EU has influence, or is it? I mean, I guess it kind of goes to this larger question that's been pointed out a couple of times, that, you know, there's still this question about cohesiveness within the European Union. Right? Because it seems, and I think again, going back to the United States, you know, and again also to Russia, I think the Russians have kind of given up on the EU as an entity, whereas they still think in terms of European, you know, maybe we can get like relations with individual European countries. And we certainly see this also with the United States, in that they tend to think in terms of, you know, yeah, EU is great, but, you know, again, you know, the US seems to be much more comfortable dealing with Britain,
Okay.
right?
One
Whereas with like, was that?
one of the easy ways to explain to you this, and I think most of the Europeans here will actually agree, is that everything is European soil. So whatever is French is also European soil. Whatever is Greek is European soil. And we act like this as Europeans, especially non-EU areas. And one of the powers that you find about the EU is that we, you know, in our passports, we have the EU emblem, and we have the, you know, that divergence, which, you know, we as Europeans, we have a very different identity vis-a-vis that of the United States. So we are Europeans, but we also have our nation states inside. So we have our nation stakes, but also we have our European, if you want, values and ethics, which are seen in the acquis communautaire of the European Union. And to tell you the truth, I mean, you know, it's totally different from the US, and I think that was very made clear from the very beginning of our discussions. But with regards to the Russians, I don't think that any European was actually expecting the Russians to understand that totally, in the sense that they have a very much centralized government, to say it very politely. And it has nothing to do neither with the United States, nor Canada, nor the EU for that matter. And actually, the relationship with Britain is because Britain used to be an EU member. Now it's a member that exited the EU, but it's also to the interest of Britain to have very good relationship with the EU, because the main exporter and the main importer of trading goods is the EU. So one of the reasons that binds us together, because of regional proximity, mostly geographical proximity. But away from this, the United States thinks and acts differently legally and politically, and I think George will be able to give us more insight on the legal aspects of the acquis communautaire in this way. But in terms of the ethical values, what makes us European is exactly that diversity that we have. So, for example, Catherine is Belgian. In this respect, but she's still European. I'm Greek. I'm still European. Jerome is French, but he's still European, and so on and so forth. But that difference between us is what makes us European. But in the soil, of any EU soil, away because of colonial powers, let's say, for example, the island of Réunion, which is French, in the Indian Ocean, for example, is European soil automatically, and legally it's European soil. That being said, the French have administrative powers on this, but usually in those aspects, what they propose can also become automatically EU policy. But at the same time, what the EU can propose for those lands is being given access by those that control administratively the area itself.
See, but I guess my question, it wasn't so much like, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. You know, my question wasn't so much in terms of like identity and stuff. It's more in terms of, you know, again, the kind of global influence, right? Is that, and even internally, we saw the Europeans. Well, there was during the migrant crisis a while back, the big one. We had quite a few, you know, to say it, put it nicely, divergent views.
Yeah.
I mean, they were basically stabbing each other in the back, left and right.
Yeah, which is normal. Which is normal. If you go North America,
yeah, sure.
North US
So I
to
guess,
South US, different challenges because of proximity to the problem itself.
So I guess my kind of, I guess really my question is, I mean, what I'm trying to figure out here is, you know, in terms of kind of European global positioning, European global influence, is there actually something like that, or is there what there is in fact French influence, right? Or there is, you know, in terms of the Ukrainian conflict, right? You have, you know, Hungarian, very different from the rest of Europe, kind of, right? Which is, you know, I guess I'm kind of thinking in terms of, you know, is there in fact domestically, okay, I mean, within the European space, yes, but around the rest of the world, is there actually a European Union, or is it basically
Yes.
you
Yes.
know,
And you
like
even
like
have,
Tyler kind of was saying, it's actually the French that are out there.
let me give you an example. In some Gulf states, one of the countries picks up on an embassy that represents the EU in its completed form, in the Commission, in your Parliament, in your institutions, and so on and so forth. Commonly done usually by Belgium or Holland or other countries that may pick up on the possible administrative or financial expense or otherwise indicated by the EU. But where you see outside the EU, you have the national embassies of the EU member states, but one of the embassies also works as a connecting tie between the European Commission and the European Parliament and the European institution, always. And that's one of the elements of progressiveness of the EU becoming a more centralized and more king. But, in the past, I remember when I was a student, there was still a debate between a more federal Europe, for example, or a more representative Europe in a Republican way. Within the EU, so we don't let go our national elements or national identities.
Co-federal or co-federal.
Or co-federal, yes. There was also the co-federal. So the discussion, this one is still ongoing, but I think the reason why the EU may not have managed to be globally a more that one voice power, if you want to call it like this, no matter who's in control administratively, has very much to do so by the fact that the strategic compass of the EU did not include a more global Europe. The first time that we see a more global Europe, therefore, the necessity for changes institutional and political for more centralized power within Brussels comes with a former commissioner, head of the commission, Barroso, who traveled for the first time just about a month before he decommissions, going to Mongolia, stating for a more global Europe. That's the very first time we hear the word more global Europe. And coming now down to 2024, where we see the Europeans talking about strategic compass of a global Europe. And global Europe means global on everything, common joint decision making on all topics related with the EU and so on and so forth. Hence also the discussion, if you want, or the delays that the EU had on trade agreements with the Mercosur states. It took them 19 years to decide on a framework which is yet to be applied, by the way, because Mercosur on the one hand had many states, but also the European Union, which not only had multiple states, but those states were developing and expanding wider and wider. The EU was becoming bigger and bigger, so you need a lot of information, skill sets, and capabilities for joint decision making. Actually, the way that public administration is done in the EU level in Brussels at this point is really a really good scientific point of methodology learning, because you have multiple languages, you have multiple ethics, multiple values, you have national caveats, you don't have national caveats, you have EU standards, you don't have EU standards, and they're all trying to adopt and adapt in the realities that we all have to speak in a single voice and in a single policy, which actually has a negative impact, if you want, on the countries which are not in proximity related with Brussels. So, for example, you will see South European states or Northeast European states that would have different approach in certain issues. Hence, for example, the example that you've put on Hungary. And don't forget that before the war in Ukraine, Poland also was raised the yellow card, as also Hungary was raised the yellow card on a lot of instances, on the way that they were anticipating issues of, for example, on the fight against migration and so on and so forth. And because of this divergence of opinions or policies or considerations on how to face those, there was a definite need for joint EU migration policy, to say the least. Let me give the floor to Jerome, and then let me give the floor to George to give us our inputs. Jerome, you raised your hand for a long time, please.
No, it's okay. It doesn't make me tired. I just like to have a small rebound on what was said by. Okay, this conflict between more federal Europe, less federal Europe. We are more French, more Europeans. It's an interesting discussion.
The moment on Brexit, Germany and France did pick up on the bilateral agreement for more EU, German-led and French-led in that respect. If you remember the agreements between the two leaders at the time.
There are a lot of things to be said about this, and especially when you look at the French, you know, the French, like if you compare to even to, you know, to the Netherlands, we are more French than the Dutch are Dutch, if you see what I mean. But I'd like to just to have a small rebound of what Kyla said, because you know, I almost felt a little sad with, you know, like you have someone from a little island which could be submerged by the floods and so on, and you look at this, you say, wow. But I'll tell you something. I think that the French like ecology. They're very green. Actually, the green can be very red as well, but this is another topic. But they're very green. Like really, the French like, you know, to eat the food of the terroir and so on. But I think this is more in relation to a discussion about Mercosur and Global South and so on. I think that what French like, you know, more than anything else is l'égalité, equality. They like fraternité, they like to be together and to see, you know, the Far Islands as the brothers and so on. But l'égalité is something supreme for France. I mean, they made a revolution for this. And even today, in the way that everywhere you can see the discussion, the political culture, it's a fact. I don't put a judgment on this. I don't say if I agree or disagree. I'm just saying the equality is a very strong things on that. And recently you've seen, actually not only in France, but also in Germany and in other parts of Europe, you've seen revolts from what we call once the peasants, today the farmers. They were in the street. You know, when you say with the Green Pact, we want to reduce pesticide by 50%, we want to reduce fertilizer by 20%, I think. We want to reach by 2030, I'm not sure about the dates now, something like a quarter of organic food. It's very nice, but then you make agreements and you import them from, maybe not from Guam, but you import them from there, from outside Europe. And there is something which is not equal for this, because in the same time, the French farmers are subject to very, very strong, in the French way, controls by the, it's for Europe, it's for the European Union Commission decision by what's voted in the parliament, in the parliaments, but it's made also the French way, very strong control. For this, I think that the French will put ecology after this lack of equality. And I think that one of the solutions which would be is that we would need to adopt the resolution in the next parliament, you know, in the parliament to vote for good laws against climate change, for, you know, everything is okay, as long as our partners outside Europe respect this, because there is no way that we're going to import products which have not followed these rules. That, I mean, I speak we French, and maybe we Germans, maybe we Europeans.
Thank you, Jerome. Point taken. But I'll give the floor to George and Epsiu now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for this initiative, which it is very, very interesting and very helpful for IS, I think, and for all of us to have the chance to hear each other and learn from each other, from the experiences or the qualities or the things that everybody is working on for many years. Luckily, I'm on the same page with everybody. I didn't hear anything that I would like to oppose, or so I will make only two comments. First of all, permit me to comment on the very interesting question of Michael. I think that he raised a very important issue. I think, in other words, Marius also raised it by the very known saying about who's going to to respond to the phone call from Washington on behalf of Europe. No one in particular, at least at the first instance. So, Michael, your question has, I think, two answers in political and in legal terms. Because I think that your focus is on the power game, not on the cultural. So for Europe, that's the mother of all. For Europeans, that's the mother of all questions. It has not been answered, and for us, for Europeans, we haven't find the final outcome of the mother of all questions, as I said, when we established European communities 70 or 80 years ago, on whether we're going to finalize this procedure by adopting a federalist political entity with common economic policies, with common security concerns, and common political and judicial or legal structure. So, to my understanding, the answer to your question is that in Europe, either the citizens or the governments have two heads, and they use the European or the state head every time concerning on what is their interest. And the example, the most characteristic example of this is the recent Treaty of Aachen between France and Germany that I have posted in the chat on January 2019, where the largest two states in Europe, the largest two states in European Union, the almost largest states in NATO, or at the security of European Council. They have decided to resolve their security or other concerns not through the platforms of EU or NATO or other platforms or regional organizations that are members to, but by agreeing a bilateral, especially bilateral treaty, which theoretically, at least theoretically, it doesn't make any sense. But practically, it makes, because they have declared that those two states are going to work together more closely than with others within European Union or NATO in order to pursue their interests. To me, in Greece or in other parts of Europe, that is a loud message, a message that that comes from the days of 800 years ago, or the days that we're trying to unify Europe under the rule of historical narratives. And that's my first point. And my second point is that I would like to congratulate Marius for his paper. That paper has managed, Marius has managed to include all these questions within a half piece of paper. So you have raised so many issues. The first is that I think I feel obliged to do is to say that I would rather use the term conservatives, not far rights or right wings or whatever in Europe. The reasons on that is that I think that we have two tides, not one tide motion, political motion in Europe. And that system have been exported recently to US or to Canada. And that motion, political motion, concerns about all the basic principles that have been established, the European architecture, let's say, or the European acquis communautaire that Marius said. The protection of human rights, the principles, the basic principles of Europe, and so on. In that sense, we can find citizens or people in Europe moving towards a more conservative approach on defending this basic principles, and others moving into a more progressive, let's say, approach. And that is more complicated than the simplistic approach that Europe is moving into a far right outcome, let's say, in far right situation. We have seen this in very intense terms recently in the US, under all this motion in the universities, within the two blocks of the political systems, especially within Democrats, where we have the leftists and the more conservative Democrats, let's say, where they have adopted the DI, let's say, political approach. And when I say DI, I mean the diversity, equity, and inclusion, how can I say, motto. And that's something that we have exported to US for the second time, because the first time we have done this almost 105 years ago with the School of Frankfurt approach, where we have injected into the political system of the US all the critical thinking that we have seen today. So all this complex diversity produces now in Europe a new parliamentary balance of power, where many policies that were very skeptical on the decision that we have made in Europe many years ago towards a more progressive and more democratic and more humanitarian, let's say, way to approach things. Now we are seeing that they don't work. They don't have the outcome that we expected. So you can see states in the Scandinavian peninsula are found themselves to shift the gear in their political gearbox and reverse these policies. Reverse the policies in the education system, in the social system, in the political system, and so on. So in Europe, we are in the verge of a new dawn, I think. And given having said that, the crisis in Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, where we have the armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and the other one in Gaza, makes all this problem even more difficult. Because I think, and without, I'm finishing. I think that we in Europe, we have the difficulty to consume a new narrative concerning our security. And that narrative have been established many years ago, since 2014 or even before, where Russia has been identified as the major security threat for Europe. I understand the logic behind this, but in Europe, that's an existential threat if we take it as a realistic one, because of the nuclear aspect of that.
Thank you.
So
As you
we are
can,
raising many issues on that. Thank you.
these were
very.
These were very valid points, and I think George, from a legal point of view, and I think he's an expert, former high-level government employee on the legal political affairs, so he actually has been engaged with a lot of EU counterparts in this respect. One of the things that shows is the complexity of the EU when it comes down to decision making, and I think George was right to stress what we said from the beginning, that depending on the geographical proximity of the EU, some things are seen differently and anticipated differently, and also handled differently when it comes down to decision making. But thank you very much, George, for this. I really appreciate it. I'm still struggling to find which paper it was that I wrote. I was on the right part, but thanks for mentioning that.
You are mentioning this one on the second paragraph, saying that the
okay.
potential victory for far right.
On the call, yes. But I also think that connects too much with what Robert said with regard to the electoral voting and what we should expect. Because one of the things that is becoming quite evident, and I don't know if other Europeans have seen it in the European area, we see candidates. We don't see their positions on several subjects, which is something quite not normal. We see that these people are supported by these ones are supported by these ones are supported by these ones, but we don't see what's their opinion on ecology or environment or migration. And we're going to hear that probably by dissemination of the media, because the media will be doing the electoral voting positioning, where several people are going to have a bit of time where they're going to have to expose themselves in several conditions and positions of the EU, because for those that have never been elected, probably they don't know how decisions are being taken. And those that are elected in the EU, they know just too much, and they have to keep it simple for an average voter. So they have to touch in the hearts and minds of the possible voter. So keeping this in mind, I think Elias could actually, if he's there, could actually give us his insights on something that we have not touched. I don't know, Elias, are you there?
Yes.
Yes. So I think this is one of the things I think we have not touched, is the consequences of technology overall to the European minds, hearts and minds. Whether this is from the point of view of information about what is happening around the world, from trade to wars to artificial intelligence technology. I know that I'm asking too much, but technology is also at the forefront of all infrastructure, or all digitization, all processes, even media outreach on the social media aspect value. And I know you're an expert on those things. You've been working on physical infrastructure, on technology infrastructure for a while. But you also have seen how the social media works, all the gatherings of Europeans and non-Europeans in the tech world. How does the tech world react? And do we have a point of contact of a potential European candidate who can or possibly can utilize the power of technology in the utility of decision making from political, sociological, economic and other affairs. What's the policy of the EU with regard to technology, and how influential is this new Gen Z generation, which utilizes extensively technology to even get informed about what is happening in the EU? Elias?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Marius. Well, these are many questions, but I will support a specific part of this of the answer that I have in mind, since I'm engaged in European Union projects, specifically in the call of smart networks and services that is mainly involved in the 6G. So I see that European Union is heavily investing into AI-enabled technologies and 6G moving forward that will be actually implemented by 2030. And also is setting bridges connecting with Japan and other Asian countries to align towards this technology, the 6G, and is trying to be, I would say, very careful and very actually doing the same like they did with 5G. So following the same path, investing heavily into the industry and the universities, without seeing clear any, what you mentioned, any political candidate or any policies to be introduced yet. But as I said, they try to combine AI and 6G. That's what they have in mind, and they are heavily engaged into this new part of technology, this AI tool that is so heavily engaged into our lives. Either you want to call it ChatGPT or Copilot or any other commercial solution that is
But
right now in the market.
is this a reason enough to vote in the EU elections for those that represent the technological part? I mean, you have the ecologists and you have the environmentalists, but you don't have technology supporters in that respect, probably because technology is everywhere at this point in our lives. But technology and information or misinformation, social media has created also volatility, financial, political inside and outside the EU.
Correct.
Can this be regulated? Because we've seen regulations on from high-tech level companies, from Microsoft and Apple, to regulatory methods on social media like TikTok and others, on Facebook, which is one of the extensive things which actually affect a possible European voter, but also affect those that are not EU citizens about the EU. What's your
I think that I think that this market that you mentioned with Facebook and Microsoft and all these big players, they are heavily monitored by European Union, and in the past and also in the future will pay fines if they don't, or penalties if they don't follow the European Union regulation. I guess that's a project in progress, the whole regulation across social media and technology, and how this affects the EU citizens is a continuous
does
project.
this make the European Union more democratic and more balanced, or does it make it more EU oriented in terms of concerned elements? Because we see that the US recently has also opened up several discussions. There's a law case against Apple, for example, which is not a common element with regards to utilities and practices, policies, governance, and so on and so forth. Are we going for a more inclusive European technology? Can we say that?
Possibly, yes, because this is always the case. This is always a dream that the European Union wants to be different from the other continents, let's say, either that's US or Australia or Asia. But at the end of the day, we see that we can make the difference. I remember back in time when the European Union was conducting research on data networks for airplanes. That was a solution that was already commercially offered in the Asian airplanes, and we were still conducting research in European Union. Sometimes we are ahead, sometimes we are behind, Usually EU is kind of behind, but is very careful. I would say we are very conservative, or compared to the other
country
to the US.
to the US, or what about Asia? I mean, Kyler correctly put at some point that Asia is in the forefront of a lot of things. I would also include technology, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. Also probably the Gulf states, like the UAE, for example, in terms of
Of
technology.
course, because imagine that in Asia we will see the first flying cars in Asia first, not in European Union. The first taxi, for example, flying cars will happen in Asia for sure.
I thought it was the UAE in that respect because the permission was given for this year.
We will see. Maybe there is a competition on that who will go first.
So although there is a global competition, we don't foresee the competition. We still see the internal elements of EU. One last question, Elias. Do you think that technology and the way that politicians are approaching social media and technology affairs, marketing, politics, and so on, and also the information or disinformation that comes on what is happening around the world around us, will it affect the average electoral voter in the EU?
I think only technological scandals, let's say, will affect the average European citizen's decision. Like the scandals, for example, that we can say in Greece in a way, that might change or affect our behavior. But technologically, I don't see everybody so excited with the new tools, as I said, with AI and how many different things we can do. You can create papers, you can create presentations. There is no limit yet in AI, and all the commercial companies are so excited. But still, European Union wants to regulate that, and they want to add a ceiling to that progress because they want to control that. They don't want AI to go out of their control. For example, AI and robots, or AI and the new algorithms. So
But
we see that there
is it because of regulatory authority that the EU or the US, for example, cannot develop such innovating or pioneering elements? We see countries that are actually heavily investing into R&D, Saudi Arabia, for example, or in the UAE, or even Israel in that respect. All the tests are done outside those regulatory areas. So then the how to sell and how to integrate in the market, considering the bioethics and all the elements that come with, or the standards come later to it. Why do you think the EU, I mean, is the EU a place of attempting this sort of like robotics or things, or you're still considering that we're still more analogic or more traditional to that respect that actually does affect the EU processing?
if we recently, like this robot called Sophia that was introduced in Greece and came and visited Greece, and everybody was trying to talk to Sophia and understand how
Sophia is Saudi.
humanitarian.
So Sophia is Saudi,
Yes,
has a Saudi passport.
yes.
Doesn't
So
have a European passport.
yes, how intelligent is Sophia? And we're trying to understand. So I think that, as I said, the European Union wants to have a control. They don't want to see the humanitarian robots being out of control here and there, doing things. They want to monitor, they want to control, and they want to regulate that because they want to protect the society. I think
So we're still
that's the main.
protective in a way, but at the same time, we want to be progressive. Thank you.
We want innovation, but we want the right applications. That's why we want to control that.
Okay, one last very short question and short answer before I give the floor to Robert, who raised his hand. Probably he wants to say some comments on this. You didn't answer the question. You dodged it. Does it affect the average European voter? Do the sequences of information flowing in, do they affect the average voter through tech or on tech?
It will affect the average voter if you can vote from a platform, for example. If you can use an e-voting platform, then this will make your life easier. You don't have to worry that you have to wake up in the morning and go and vote. You can do it from your home, for example.
Okay.
I think that's a technology I understand from this voting process. I
Okay.
don't see any other technological
Thank you very much. Thank you
parameter.
very much. Thank you very much. Robert, the floor is yours. You got 2 minutes for this until I give the last, but not least, to Dimitris Makousis.
I endorse, just want to endorse the largest part of what Elia said about the regulatory impulse. The rationale may be to protect society, but also along with that, one must recognize that the organizational culture and the bureaucratic culture that dominates the European institutions is a combination historically and today of Central European dirigisme and French and Italian corporatism. This is regulatory. This is for large economic trusts. Where does technological advance come from? It comes from entrepreneurs. Where is the support for entrepreneurialism in the EU? Well, maybe it probably left with the UK, actually, although Vestager tried to promote it. Don't take this the wrong way, but I started my career as a student of Soviet technology and politics. And they tried to plan technological innovation and manage it from the top down. It didn't work. I don't know why it would work in the European Union, because you need brainstorming, you need initiative, you need risk-taking. And those are things that the European institutions don't encourage. I'll conclude my brief intervention, Marios, by recalling the origin of the European technology policy, which was, what are we going to do about the American Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars? Remember under Reagan, Star Wars? What was the answer? There were two things that the European Union created. One was the European Defense Initiative, the EDI, and the second was the Eureka program. The EDI was a subsidy to German industry, and the Eureka program was a subsidy to French industry. Now, Eureka still exists, and it's a lot more than that now. But this translates the difficulty of top-down technological innovation, which given, I'll just conclude on repeating the main point, given the historical evolution and the cultural origins, which are still very much alive, of the European bureaucracy, of the European institutions, it is driven by Central European dirigism and French and Italian corporatism. And this does not encourage any of the three things that I mentioned, entrepreneurialism and so on, risk-taking and so on, that historically do drive. And you can look around the world and in the US and see that they still drive technological innovation. And the protecting the public from technology is some people, not me, I wouldn't say this, but some people would call it an ideological fig leaf that protects the basic economic interests that the bureaucracy serves. I'm not saying that, but a friend of mine said that, and I found it interesting.
Thank you very much, Robert. Point taken. Very interesting one. Dimitri, before I give the floor to you, I would like to hear a bit from Catherine, who's, I think you now represent males, females, with regards to how do people see it from a business development point of view. You are our business development director here at Strategy International. I know you're Belgian. So you have the best of the both sides, both of the US and Belgium. I don't know if you want to say anything about equality between genders, or the topic that is more important on security and safety of all Europeans within the EU or outside the EU. Do you have anything to add on this, maybe? But you have to unmute.
Yes, hello. In terms of gender issues and related policies, we still see that there is a big discrepancy on both sides of the Atlantic regarding female and now other LGBTQ individuals when it comes to positions of higher status, whether it be within the EU Commission or Parliament, Council, as well as in the United States. So this is an ongoing issue that hopefully as time progresses, will continue to open up more for those that are in the minority at the moment. And we will see how policies then evolve and evolve given these new insights from the new additions to these institutions from a female and the LGBTQ perspective, because of course, these individuals will have different perspectives and different priorities, and it will shape the upcoming EU policies and any of the new EU accession countries as well, potentially.
Understood.
With and the same is also true on the, if I put my American hat on, this is also an issue that is raised very frequently in the US. Perhaps we see more articles and interviews on this topic here in the US than we do on the European side, because the LGBTQ community is very vocal and has continued to expand the individuals that are within that category, for lack of a better way of saying it. And then the second component, Marios, again, please.
I mean, how do you feel as a European citizen? Is it more safe nowadays with the EU? How does an average European feels with all these elements taking place, you know, in the periphery of the EU or within the EU, male or female in that case, or balanced, let's say?
You know, quite frankly, I think on both sides, from my perspective, there is an increased level of violence in both the US and I can say from what I am seeing here on the ground in Belgium. For example, yesterday I read an article that in the past week there have been 2 stabbings of individuals who were riding a train from, I believe, Antwerp Central Station to, one was going to Leuven, which is a university town outside of Brussels, and the other was going to another location, a smaller town that I can't recall the name of. Now, these are the types of things that are very unusual normally in Belgium. The article even stated itself that it was almost like an anomaly, because in general, trains have been considered more or less safe areas, although given what's been happening over the last, 10, 12 years, we've seen other individuals in France, for example, being attacked on trains in other locations. So
crime is on the rise, which is something that affects us. And I think most of us will actually agree that in the European area, crime has been going up. And I think this is also a reason for others to vote because of that crime raise. And also the incompetence of ending elements of crime. So this is important also to say. Yep.
The other thing that's happening here on the ground in Belgium is we have a big drug gang problem now. I think this has developed over the past few years. It's not something that I've been focused on as I'm usually in the States. But apparently the port of Antwerp is doing the bulk of the location for the bulk of the drug shipments coming from Latin America or through Africa these days, Latin America, Africa, and then up to Europe. The other issue now that we face is, so there's an increased level of violence and crime in Antwerp regarding to drugs. And then also Brussels now, which has always had in certain parts of the city a greater element of crime in it. But now it seems to be expanding more throughout Brussels. There's a very famous street that's a shopping street, Avenue Louise, in downtown Brussels. And I read yesterday that there was a gentleman who was shot in the head twice, and he was found on the ground on Avenue Louise. It was late in the evening, and they think that it is most likely related to a gang issue. But that just shows that the element of criminality is now coming out from outside of the shadows, shall we say, of Brussels to more of what is considered, a relatively posh area with high-end shopping. So this then, of course, concerns reading these types of things, then all citizens become concerned because, you know, what I read is read in news that is read by everyone here. It's not specific journals or something like that. So in general, I think there is an increased worry about migration issues, the drug issues, and all that comes with these types of elements and how we are actually going to sort that out in the future in a strategic and organized manner. Because at this point, it just seems like people are running from one, trying to, you know, catch one or solve one problem, and then another one pops up at another location. And there needs to be an overall balanced method of doing this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And last but not least, Dimitris Makous, before we close this session, I think we have extended it to 2 hours. I think next time one of the lessons to be learned is to keep it at 1 hour and a half. Obviously, we cannot cover everything. But Dimitris, I know your environment, your energy, what's your intake on Europe and the electoral elements?
First of all, thank you, Marius, for inviting me. I'm very glad to participate in this session. Many thanks to our colleagues here for their previous comments. I could talk about, touch on many of the subjects that have been mentioned already, but I'll try to keep it short. Some comments about the elections. Previous elections, they were conducted in a smoother landscape, more or less. This time, things are more serious, I would say. With the war in Ukraine and all the conflicts breaking out, the situation tends to, transform from what we have been used to something else. In this context, the two primary powers in the European Union, those who advocate for sovereignty and those who are more keen to choose a more federal Europe, they have created this discourse. It's created a rift within the societal and political realities in Europe, and the societal, the one feeds the other. In my view, what we're seeing here is the fact that those who advocate for sovereignty, and more power to the nation states, are those, and this is perhaps a dichotomy and a paradox that we are witnessing here. They advocate for a more active role for the European Union in the world. And as it was mentioned, what's going to be the role of the European Union? What's its relevance? This contradiction with those who advocate for sovereignty and the other faction is that those who are working towards a more federal Europe, they essentially want to implement a plan. They are working from a neoliberal perspective that it's no longer relevant Um, from this point of view, it seems a little bit contradictory that those who are, more into the nation state, they also tend to ask for policies that are going to foreign policies that are going to show that European Union is more active and is stronger than it seems. So this is a very important thing, and I'm mentioning it because I sense that there is a certain fear in the public discourse for the future elections, but I don't have the same feeling about it. It's a democratic process, and European Union is about democracy. This kind of difference, it essentially reflects a reality, in my view. Globalization has not worked well for everybody. We had the migration crisis in 2015, and we have seen that, because it was mentioned that about the political coalitions, we have already seen that powers that are more socialist or centrist, they are adopting policies advocated by the so-called right-wing parties. So in essence, all that fear that is being stirred up in the public discourse, I believe that it's already taking its place in reality, because if reality changes, then we have to change what we're doing in order to evolve in a way, in a parallel with reality. We cannot live in a world that is no longer present. In my view, this is what's happening, and sometimes we see, an indecisive European Union going back and forth. We also seen that in energy and environmental policies, although sometimes, okay, there's a vision we have, but the important thing is, can we really implement all these policies in reality? This is something that I don't see European putting their hands on so much, the institutions and so on. I think that we should really think through all that, given the geopolitical conflicts and antagonisms that are developing. And I think that we should, not indulge in somehow this a spirit of conflict within Europe towards the election, and of course afterwards. I mean, from what my view is that these political currents, they have to, at some point, even if it sounds, I don't know, not so feasible or perhaps popular as an idea, they have to reach some kind of an agreement, because the challenges for European Union, whether we have a more state-centrist policy or I don't know, development in Europe, or more federalist, the challenges will be present. And I think that we should focus on that. And I believe that since it's already happening in reality, we have the possibility, and we have to, it's not just a possibility, it's a necessity to do that in practice.
Thank you very much. And I think with your points, and I think with Kitchen's points on equality and women and security also, but also the security of the whole EU, and those challenges are affecting the EU within the EU and outside the EU are some of the issues that we're going to have to face. We did not go into much extended elements with regards to the possibility, if you want, of having a more globalized EU. You know, the European Union is big, so we want to concentrate more on the electoral parts and what we are to expect. Some of the things that are coming out are clear. The Europeans are concerned about internal issues and national issues and periphery within the periphery of the EU issues. They're also, they're also concerned about what's going to happen outside the EU in its immediate periphery. But we're yet to reach out, if you want, the global element. So we're looking at things from a bilateral perspective. And as you've seen, probably from the point of view of our experts, which are not all from the European Union, their view about the EU, and this is important, is diverse. What the EU represents, what it is, how it reflects, how effective or ineffective it can be, how clear or not clear it can be. And these are some of the obstacles and some of the challenges that the new leadership elected and the new leadership appointed will have to face, if you want. The challenges are coming in within the EU itself. I've not spoken too much about the Middle East, but I've not spoken too much about Russia, Ukraine, and how this affects the foreign security policy of the EU. But we will have the opportunity to speak in the near future. I think our next session in the following month will be announced by Strategy International. And one of the most important things will be that we will inform you all for those that are part of Strategy International, and we're going to be having another meeting of experts on the topic that we will choose. And we will announce it to you within the email of the experts, and we'll be able to record another session. Just one thing that is clear and evident from this event is that we'll try to keep it shorter in time. So we're going to be spending no more than an hour and a half in order to be able to not delay also, or allow people for them to see the whole event rather than a 2-hour event. But this was a very, very interesting discussion. I do thank you all for participating. And I think this was a very good start, Jerome. And thank you for this idea that Strategy International will also be represented more constantly through our online platforms. And for all of you that have been watching this this scientific gathering of our experts at Strategy International, please like, share, subscribe, and follow to our social media on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, but also our YouTube channel, and also have a look at our podcast and web series, but also visit our articles or from our experts, the ones that are writing and sharing their opinions, but also our commentaries and our highlights and much, much, much more. Thank you very much all for being here today. I wish you a very good end of day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.